It was the summer of 2015, and I had just turned 28. I had spent years dreaming of taking a solo camping trip in one of the vast forests of the United States. Having grown up in the Midwest, I always had a fascination with the wild, untamed beauty of nature. This year, I finally had the time and resources to make it happen. After doing some research, I decided on the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas. The forest was vast, remote, and not too crowded. A perfect spot to disconnect from the world. I drove down in my aging but reliable SUV, loaded with camping gear, food, and a sense of adventure. The drive was long, winding through small towns and long stretches of highway. I arrived at the edge of the forest late in the afternoon. The ranger station was deserted, so I grabbed a map from the box outside, marked a spot I thought would be secluded enough, and headed into the woods. The trail was rough but manageable, and after about an hour of hiking, I found a spot near a small, clear stream. It was perfect. Tall trees surrounded the area, and the sounds of the forest, chirping birds, rustling leaves, and the gentle trickle of the stream were calming. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and cooked a simple dinner. As the sun set, the forest became dark, and the temperature dropped. The first night was uneventful. I fell asleep to the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. The morning was crisp and quiet, with sunlight filtering through the trees. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I followed the stream for a while, marveling at the beauty around me. The forest felt alive, but there was no sign of other people. By the second afternoon, I noticed something odd. While walking back to my camp, I saw footprints in the dirt along the stream. They were fresh, larger than mine, and deeper, suggesting someone heavier had been walking there. I hadn't seen or heard anyone since entering the forest, which struck me as strange. I brushed it off, telling myself it was probably another camper who had passed through earlier. That evening, I couldn't shake a sense of unease. As darkness fell, the forest seemed different, quieter, almost too quiet. The usual sounds of insects and distant animals were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. I tried to tell myself I was overthinking things, but I couldn't relax. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of movement outside my tent. It wasn't the usual rustling of animals. It was deliberate, heavy footsteps. My heart raced as I lay there, listening. The steps moved closer, then stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. After a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself it must have been a deer or some other large animal. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. About 10 feet from my tent, there were footprints, the same large ones I'd seen near the stream. They circled my campsite before disappearing into the woods. Someone had been there, watching me as I slept. I debated leaving immediately, but my pride got the better of me. I told myself I was overreacting and that it was probably a coincidence. Still, I decided to move my camp further into the forest, away from the trail and stream. I found a new spot that seemed even more secluded and set up my tent again. That night, the unease returned. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I lay in my tent, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were closer and slower, circling my tent. My chest tightened as I realized this was no animal. It was a person. I stayed frozen, listening as the steps stopped, then started again, moving away. When morning came, I found more footprints, this time right outside my tent. Whoever it was had stood there for a long time before leaving. I decided I had had enough. I packed up my gear as quickly as possible and started hiking back toward my car. The forest, which had felt so inviting just days ago, now felt menacing. Every sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. As I reached the last stretch of trail before the parking area, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Leaning against my car was a man. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and dirty clothes. He wasn't carrying any gear, which struck me as odd for someone in the middle of the forest. He didn't say anything, just stared at me as I approached. I slowed my pace, unsure of what to do. My keys were in my pocket, but there was no way I could get into the car without passing him. I stopped about 20 feet away, pretending to adjust my pack while trying to think of a plan. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. His voice was low and gravelly, but I could barely make out what he said. "You lost." I shook my head, mumbling something about heading home. He stared at me for another moment, then stepped away from the car, disappearing into the trees. I didn't waste a second. I ran to my car, threw my gear inside, and sped off. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about how he had gotten there. The nearest road was miles away, and I hadn't seen any vehicles or signs of other campers. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He must have been following me the entire time. I never went back to that forest, and I don't think I ever will. The woods, once a place of peace and solitude, now feel like a trap. I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but the thought of him watching me, circling my tent in the dead of night, still haunts me. I work as a teller at a small bank in upstate New York. It's a mundane job, but it pays the bills, and I'm good at it. Numbers, procedures, and people, I can handle those easily. But there's one thing that helps me keep my sanity in that monotony. Camping. Being out in nature, away from the cold, structured walls of the bank, feels like freedom. In October of 2018, I planned a weekend trip to the Catskill Mountains. It was something I'd done plenty of times before, but this time I decided to camp a little deeper into the woods, far from the usual campgrounds. I wanted the solitude, the peace of being completely alone. After all, isn't that the point of camping? I packed the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small first aid kit, flashlight, and some fire starting tools. I also brought a knife, not because I expected trouble, but because it felt wrong not to have one. The drive was uneventful. I left work a little early on Friday, telling my manager I needed some me time, and drove 3 hours to a trailhead I'd found online. The weather was perfect for camping. Cool, crisp air, with a clear sky forecasted for the weekend. The autumn leaves painted the forest in shades of orange and red. I parked my car at the trailhead, locked it up, and started hiking. My pack was heavy, but I didn't mind. The air was fresh, and the crunch of leaves under my boots was oddly comforting. I passed a couple of other hikers near the start of the trail, but as I went deeper, I was completely alone. By late afternoon, I found a clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. It was flat, surrounded by tall trees, and far enough off the trail that I wouldn't be disturbed. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some canned stew over the fire, stared at the stars, and let the sounds of the forest lull me to sleep. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to explore the area. I left most of my gear at the campsite, carrying only my knife, some water, and a granola bar in case I got hungry. The forest was even more beautiful in the daylight, with sunlight filtering through the trees and a slight breeze rustling the leaves. After walking for about an hour, I came across something odd, a pile of rocks, stacked neatly in a small clearing. It looked deliberate, not something nature would create on its own. It wasn't particularly large, maybe 3 feet high, but it felt out of place. I chalked it up to some previous camper or hiker and kept moving. As the day went on, I saw more of these rock piles, some smaller, some larger. They were scattered throughout the area, always in clearings, always neatly stacked. It started to feel unsettling. Who had made them, and why? By late afternoon, I decided to head back to my campsite. I hadn't seen anyone else all day, but the rock piles made me feel like I wasn't truly alone. When I got back to my campsite, I froze. Something was wrong. My tent was open, the flap unzipped, and my gear was scattered. The fire pit I'd made was destroyed, the rocks strewn around the clearing. My first thought was animals, but that didn't make sense. Animals wouldn't unzip a tent. I scanned the area, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't see anyone or anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent the next hour collecting my gear and putting my camp back in order. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting someone or something to appear. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the forest, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig, made me jump. I kept the knife close, gripping it so tightly my hand ached. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, it was still dark. My fire had burned out, and the forest was eerily silent. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from the direction of the trail. I held my breath, my heart racing. The steps got closer, crunching on the dry leaves. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. I gripped the knife and peered out of the tent. The moonlight was bright enough to see the clearing, but I didn't see anyone. The footsteps stopped, but the silence was worse. I stayed awake until dawn, too scared to move or make a sound. When the first light of morning broke, I finally mustered the courage to step out of the tent. The clearing was empty, but there was something new, another rock pile, right in the center of my campsite. This one was larger, almost 4 feet high and perfectly balanced. I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and hiked back to my car. The whole way, I felt like I was being followed, but every time I looked back, the trail was empty. When I reached the trailhead and saw my car, I nearly cried with relief. I threw my gear into the trunk and sped off without looking back. I never went back to that trail, and I stopped camping alone after that. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me, but every time I think about those rock piles, I get chills. Something about them felt wrong, deliberate, like they were a message or a warning. And the fact that they appeared in my campsite, overnight without a sound, still haunts me. It was late October, and the weather had just started to get chilly. My wife, Emily, had been talking about going camping for weeks. Her stepsister, Megan, had recently moved back to town after living out of state for a few years. Megan and Emily were close, even though their lives had taken very different paths. Megan loved the outdoors and suggested we all go camping together. I wasn't big on the idea, but I figured it would be a nice way to spend time with them both. We decided on a remote campsite about 3 hours away from the city. It was in a state park with miles of dense forest, a large lake, and trails that seemed to go on forever. Megan picked the spot, saying it would be quiet and far from other campers. By the time we arrived, it was already late afternoon. The drive had been long, and the last stretch of the road turned into a rough dirt trail that made our SUV rattle. There wasn't much around except trees, and the only sign of civilization was an old ranger station about 5 miles back. We parked at the designated spot and hiked another 20 minutes to the clearing Megan had chosen. The campsite was tucked between tall pines and overlooked a small stream. It was beautiful in a way that felt isolated, almost too quiet. We set up 2 tents, one for Megan and one for Emily and me. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the trees, and we built a fire to ward off the chill creeping into the air. As the evening wore on, we ate, laughed, and shared stories. The fire crackled, and the stars above were brighter than I'd ever seen. For the first time in a while, I felt completely relaxed. But then things started to feel off. It began subtly, just small sounds in the woods. A rustle here, a twig snapping there. I chalked it up to animals. We were in their territory, after all. Emily noticed it too and gave me a nervous glance. Megan, on the other hand, seemed unfazed and brushed it off as deer or raccoons. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. Megan crawled into her tent, and Emily and I did the same. I lay awake for a while, listening to the faint sounds of the forest. The wind made the trees creak, and every now and then, I thought I heard something heavier moving beyond the clearing. I finally drifted off but woke up a few hours later to a strange noise. It was faint at first, like someone breathing heavily just outside the tent. I nudged Emily, who was fast asleep, and strained to listen. The noise stopped. I convinced myself it was nothing and tried to go back to sleep, but my mind wouldn't let me. Just as I was about to drift off again, I heard Megan's tent zipper. I figured she needed to use the bathroom, but her shadow passed in front of our tent and kept going, heading into the woods. That struck me as odd. Who walks into the forest in the middle of the night without saying anything? I whispered to Emily, waking her up this time, and told her what I saw. She looked concerned but said Megan was probably fine. I wasn't so sure, so I got up to check. The air was cold, and the forest seemed darker than before. I grabbed a flashlight and scanned the area. Megan's tent was unzipped, but she wasn't in sight. I called her name softly, not wanting to wake Emily or draw too much attention. No response. I stepped closer to the tree line, shining the light into the woods. The beam illuminated twisted branches and thick underbrush, but no sign of Megan. My stomach churned as I thought about the possibility of her getting lost. Or worse. Then I saw it. About 30 yards away, there was something on the ground. At first, I thought it was Megan, but as I got closer, I realized it was just her jacket. It was torn, the sleeve ripped clean off, and there were scratches on the fabric like it had been dragged. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't normal. I turned back toward the campsite, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. Something or someone was standing just beyond the trees. I shined the flashlight in that direction, but it was gone. Panic set in. I ran back to the tents and shook Emily awake. She could see the fear in my eyes, and I quickly explained what I'd found. She grabbed her phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Megan was still missing, and I had no idea what to do. Emily wanted to go search for her, but I insisted we stay put. If Megan was out there, she might find her way back to the campsite. Wandering into the woods in the dark felt like a death sentence. Hours passed, but Megan didn't return. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was eerily silent. I kept the flashlight trained on the tree line, half expecting whatever I'd seen earlier to step into view. As dawn broke, we packed up and decided to head back to the ranger station for help. I didn't want to leave, but we had no choice. We followed the trail back to the car, my heart racing with every step. About halfway there, we found something that made my blood run cold. Megan's boots, neatly placed side by side in the middle of the path. They were clean, as if she had taken them off intentionally, but there was no sign of her anywhere. It didn't make sense. We finally reached the ranger station and reported Megan missing. A search party was organized, and they combed the area for days, but no trace of her was ever found. To this day, I can't explain what happened. The only thing I know for sure is that something was out there with us that night. Something that took Megan. And whatever it wasn't an animal. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. Life in the city had worn me down, and I needed a break. I planned everything meticulously. A remote location in Wyoming's Wind River Range, away from the crowds and the noise. The year was 2019, and I was 32, still young enough to enjoy solitude but old enough to appreciate the importance of preparation. I double-checked my gear: a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, water filtration tablets, and a reliable GPS. The drive took most of the day. As the paved roads turned to gravel, I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. This part of the wilderness wasn't frequented by many. That was the appeal: no other hikers, no cars, just me and nature. The last stretch was particularly rough, and I parked my truck at the end of an overgrown dirt path. From there, it was a 6-mile hike to the site I'd scouted on the map, a flat spot near a small lake surrounded by dense pine trees. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was dipping below the horizon. I quickly set up my tent, boiled some water for a dehydrated meal, and sat by the fire as darkness settled around me. The stars were breathtaking, so bright and clear without any light pollution. I felt small but content, a tiny speck in this vast wilderness. The first night passed uneventfully, though I woke a few times to the sound of rustling outside the tent. It could have been anything: a breeze through the trees, a small animal foraging. I told myself it was nothing and went back to sleep. The second day started beautifully. I spent the morning exploring the area, snapping photos of the lake and the rugged peaks in the distance. I fished a little and caught a small trout, which I cooked over my campfire for lunch. Everything felt perfect, like I had found a slice of paradise. As the afternoon wore on, the weather shifted. Clouds rolled in, and the wind picked up. I decided to stay close to camp. Around 4 p.m., I noticed something strange: a single boot print in the mud near the edge of the lake. It wasn't mine. The tread was different, and it looked fresh. First, I brushed it off. Maybe another hiker had been here recently, though I hadn't seen or heard anyone since arriving. Still, the sight of it lingered in my mind. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I gathered firewood, feeling a growing sense of unease. By the time I lit the fire that evening, the wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness. That night was worse. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of snapping branches. Not the small kind you'd expect from a raccoon or deer, but something heavier. I lay there, heart pounding, straining to hear over the sound of my breathing. The noise came again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. Shining the beam into the trees, I saw nothing. The forest was silent now, as if holding its breath. I stood there for a while, scanning the darkness, before retreating back into the tent. Sleep didn't come easily after that. The third day felt different. The air was heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I packed up camp early, deciding to cut the trip short. As I made my way back toward the trailhead, I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. A shadow darting behind a tree, a flash of something pale in the underbrush. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Halfway back to the truck, I came across another boot print. This one was clearer than the first and pointed in the same direction I was headed. It wasn't until then that I realized how quiet the forest had become. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the trail and my own labored breathing. When I finally reached the truck, relief washed over me. I tossed my pack in the bed and climbed into the cab, locking the doors behind me. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath, before starting the engine. As I turned onto the gravel road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. About 2 miles down the road, I saw something in my rearview mirror. A figure standing in the middle of the path, partially obscured by the trees. I couldn't make out any details, but it was tall and motionless. My stomach dropped. I didn't stop to look closer. The rest of the drive was a blur. I didn't relax until I hit pavement and saw the lights of a small gas station ahead. I pulled in, parked under the bright fluorescence, and sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was tired and spooked from being alone in the wilderness. But when I got out to fill the tank, I noticed something on the back window of my truck, a single muddy handprint. It was too large to be mine. It was the summer of 2015, and I decided to take a camping trip to clear my head. I had just turned 27, and life in the city was suffocating. The stress of work, the endless noise, and the constant motion made me crave solitude. I chose a remote area in the Ozarks, far from any towns or populated trails. I wanted to be alone, surrounded by nature, with nothing but the sounds of the forest to keep me company. I drove out early on a Friday morning, my car packed with all the essentials. A tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, and a few tools I thought might come in handy. The road leading to the campsite was a narrow dirt path, barely wide enough for my car. It was lined with dense trees, their branches intertwining overhead, creating a tunnel of green. The deeper I drove, the more the outside world seemed to fade away. I finally reached the spot I had found online, a clearing near a small creek, surrounded by tall pines. It was perfect. The air smelled fresh, tinged with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. I could hear the gentle trickle of the creek nearby, and birds chirped somewhere in the distance. I set up my tent in the clearing, making sure it was on flat ground, and arranged my gear. By late afternoon, I had a small fire going. I sat in a folding chair, enjoying the peacefulness, the kind you can't find in the city. As the sun dipped lower, the forest around me grew quieter. The birds stopped singing, and the breeze that had been rustling the leaves all day died down. It wasn't eerie, just still. As night fell, I crawled into my tent. The fire outside still glowed faintly, casting soft light across the clearing. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of the tent, letting the calm wash over me. The sound of the creek was soothing, and I quickly drifted off to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, unsure of what had disturbed me. It was pitch black inside the tent. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the darkness as I turned it on. Everything inside the tent was as I had left it. My backpack, my boots, my water bottle. I listened intently, but the only sound was the creak and the occasional chirp of crickets. I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a dream, or perhaps I had shifted in my sleep. I turned off the flashlight and tried to go back to sleep. But just as I was about to drift off again, I heard it. A faint rustling sound, like someone stepping on dry leaves. It was coming from outside, near the edge of the clearing. I sat up, my heart pounding. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a deer, but the sound didn't move away. It stayed in the same spot, the rustling slow and deliberate. It didn't sound like an animal scavenging. It sounded like someone walking. I grabbed the flashlight and my knife. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The air was cool, and the fire had nearly died, leaving the clearing in near darkness. I shone the flashlight around, its beam cutting through the night. Nothing. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. But then I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the clearing, standing between two trees, was a man. He was barely visible in the dim light, but I could make out his silhouette. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, and wore what looked like a dark jacket. I couldn't make out his face, but I could feel his eyes on me. My mouth went dry, and I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. I wanted to call out to ask who he was, but the words wouldn't come. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. Finally, I took a step back toward my tent, not taking my eyes off him. He didn't move. Slowly, I retreated inside and zipped the tent closed. I sat there, clutching the knife, listening. The rustling started again, this time moving around the clearing, circling my tent. I held my breath, every nerve in my body on edge. Eventually, the sound stopped. I waited, straining to hear any movement, but the forest had gone silent again. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the knife tightly, my ears alert for any noise. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing looked peaceful in the morning light, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I searched the area where I had seen the man, but there were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. I decided to pack up and leave. As much as I wanted to believe it was my imagination, I couldn't shake the unease. I hurriedly stuffed my gear into the car, constantly glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man standing there again. The drive back to the main road felt endless. The trees that had seemed so beautiful on the way in now felt oppressive, their shadows stretching across the narrow path. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement in my rearview mirror, but every time I looked back, the road was empty. I finally reached the highway and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. When I got home, I double-checked all the locks on my doors and windows. For weeks, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man standing there in the trees, watching me. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I never went camping alone again. And sometimes, late at night, I still think I hear footsteps outside my window. I never thought camping near the US-Mexico border would be any different than the other trips I'd taken. My name's David, and back in the summer of 2019, I was 32 and had just started taking solo camping trips as a way to clear my head. After a bad breakup, I found solace in the open skies, remote trails, and the sense of self-reliance that came with being out in nature. That July, I picked a spot just a few miles north of the border in southern Arizona, near the Coronado National Forest. I'd read about the area online. Quiet, rugged, and scenic. What appealed to me most was how remote it seemed. Hardly anyone ventured into this part of the desert. For a guy looking to be alone, it seemed perfect. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, a decent supply of water and food, a GPS device, and my trusty knife. I didn't think I'd need anything more. The drive out there was uneventful. Dusty highways stretched for miles under a blistering sun, and as I got closer to the forest, the scenery became more rugged. Cactus-covered hills, jagged cliffs, and dry riverbeds. I reached the dirt road that led to the campsite late in the afternoon. It was barely a road at all, just a narrow, bumpy path cutting through scrubby desert. I parked my truck at a flat spot surrounded by low hills. The place felt isolated, which is exactly what I wanted. After setting up my tent and unloading my gear, I spent some time exploring the area. The landscape was stunning in its desolation. Endless stretches of desert dotted with saguaro cacti, mesquite trees, and occasional patches of rocky terrain. By sunset, the air had cooled, and the sky was painted with streaks of red and orange. I built a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat back to watch the stars come out. Out here, far from city lights, the night sky was incredible. I was just beginning to relax when I noticed something unusual. Off in the distance, on a hill to the south, I saw a faint light. At first, I thought it might be a fellow camper, but as I watched, it seemed to move erratically, flickering and shifting position. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe just a reflection or someone using a flashlight. But as the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The light disappeared for a while, then reappeared closer, though still far enough away that I couldn't make out what it was. I tried to ignore it, but an uneasy feeling crept over me. I eventually crawled into my tent, hoping to get some sleep, but I couldn't relax. Every sound outside seemed amplified: the rustling of wind through the brush, the distant howl of a coyote, the occasional snap of a twig. I told myself it was just the desert playing tricks on me. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up abruptly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had died down to embers, and the tent was pitch black. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on gravel. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound grew louder, coming from the direction of the truck. Someone or something was out there. I reached for my knife and sat completely still, straining to hear. The footsteps paused, then started again, circling around my campsite. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Who would be out here in the middle of the night? This wasn't a popular camping spot, and I hadn't seen another vehicle for miles. The footsteps stopped near the edge of the tent, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, slowly, the zipper of my tent began to move. I acted on pure instinct, slashing at the fabric with my knife and shouting as loud as I could. Whoever it was took off running, their footsteps fading into the distance. I scrambled out of the tent, my knife still in hand, and scanned the area with my flashlight. There was no one in sight, but I found fresh footprints in the dirt leading away from the camp. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the fire going and stayed alert, my knife close at hand. When morning finally came, I decided to pack up and leave. But as I was loading my gear into the truck, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were more footprints than I'd seen in the dark, at least 3 sets, all circling my campsite. I drove out of there as fast as I could, constantly checking the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I reached a small town about an hour away. I later learned that the area I'd camped in was a known route for smugglers, people and drugs moving across the border. I must have stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time. That trip was the last time I went camping alone. To this day, I can't shake the memory of those footsteps in the dark, and the realization that I wasn't just being watched, I was being surrounded. I was 29 years old when I decided to go on a solo camping trip to the remote wilderness of Montana in the summer of 2015. Life had been overwhelming, and I needed some time alone to clear my head. I wanted to escape the constant noise of the city and the endless notifications on my phone. A few days out in nature sounded like the perfect remedy. I chose a spot deep within the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness, far from popular trails. The area was known for its untouched beauty, rugged terrain, and sparse human activity. I packed everything I thought I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, food, a water filtration system, a first aid kit, and a reliable GPS. I had done some hiking and camping before, but this was my first time venturing so far out alone. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful. The gravel road wound through dense pine forests and opened up occasionally to reveal stunning views of the mountains. When I arrived, the parking lot was empty, just as I'd hoped. I shouldered my backpack, double-checked my gear, and set off down the trail. The first day was perfect. The weather was clear, the air crisp and cool. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the trail and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. By late afternoon, I had hiked about 8 miles and found a flat, secluded spot near a small creek to set up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and cooked a simple meal on my portable stove. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the wilderness around me transformed. The birdsong faded, replaced by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant howl of a coyote. I sat by the fire for a while, enjoying the solitude, before crawling into my tent. The next morning, I woke up with the sun. After a quick breakfast, I packed up and continued hiking deeper into the wilderness. The terrain became more challenging, with steep inclines and rocky paths. By midday, I reached a high ridge that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding landscape. I stood there for a long time, taking it all in. That afternoon, I descended into a valley and decided to set up camp by a larger creek. The spot was idyllic, surrounded by towering trees and dotted with wildflowers. I spent the evening exploring the area, taking photos and jotting down notes in my journal. As night fell, I noticed a change in the atmosphere. It was subtle at first, a faint unease that I couldn't quite place. The forest seemed quieter than the previous night, and I felt an inexplicable urge to keep looking over my shoulder. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I woke up abruptly in the middle of the night. My heart was pounding, and I wasn't sure why. I lay still, listening. The forest was completely silent, which was strange. Usually, even at night, there were sounds, crickets, frogs, the occasional rustle of leaves. But now there was nothing. Then I heard it, a faint snapping sound, like a twig breaking. It was close, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear more. A few minutes passed, and I heard it again. This time, it was louder and closer. The sound wasn't random, like an animal foraging. It was deliberate, as if someone or something was moving cautiously through the woods. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. I shone the light in the direction of the sound, but all I saw were trees and shadows. I stayed awake for hours listening, but the sound didn't come back. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. I tried to shake off the unease from the night before as I packed up camp and continued my hike. The trail became harder to follow as it climbed into the mountains. By late afternoon, I realized I had lost the trail entirely. I wasn't too worried at first. I had my GPS and a detailed map of the area. I retraced my steps and eventually found the trail again. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I camped in a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. I built a larger fire than usual, hoping it would make me feel safer. As I sat by the fire, I noticed that my food supply was running low. I had brought enough for 5 days, but I had underestimated how much I'd eat after hours of strenuous hiking. When I finally went to bed, I made sure to keep my bear spray and knife within reach. I woke up again in the middle of the night. This time, there was no doubt. Something was out there. I heard soft footsteps circling my tent, followed by a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down my spine. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. I grabbed my flashlight and bear spray and unzipped the tent. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the clearing. I shone the light around but saw nothing. The footsteps had stopped. I stayed outside for a long time, scanning the darkness. My instincts screamed at me to pack up and leave, but I knew it was too dangerous to hike in the dark. I retreated to my tent, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found tracks around my campsite. They were human, barefoot, with toes digging into the soft earth. They circled my tent multiple times and then disappeared into the forest. Panic set in. Whoever was out there had been watching me, walking around my camp while I slept. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the trailhead. I hiked all day, moving as quickly as I could without stopping to rest. The sense of being watched never left me. Several times, I thought I heard movement behind me, but when I turned around, the trail was empty. By late afternoon, I realized I wouldn't make it back to the trailhead before dark. I found a spot to camp near a small stream and set up my tent. I built a fire and sat with my back against a large rock, so nothing could approach me from behind. As night fell, the noises started again. Footsteps, the snap of branches, the rustle of leaves. This time they were closer. I held my bear spray tightly, my eyes darting around the dark forest. Suddenly, the noises stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a figure, just at the edge of the firelight. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with wild hair and dirty clothes. He stood there, staring at me, his face obscured by shadows. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Then he took a step forward. I shouted, raising the bear spray, and he stopped. For a long moment, we stared at each other, neither of us moving. Then he turned and melted back into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I packed up and ran. The hike back to the trailhead was a blur. I didn't stop, didn't eat, didn't drink. When I finally saw my car, I almost cried with relief. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man following me. Even now, years later, I can't forget his face or the feeling of being hunted. I reported the incident to the park rangers, but they found no trace of him. They said it was probably a drifter or a hermit, someone living off the grid. But I know what I felt out there. He wasn't just watching me. He was waiting,